I'll just jump right in now to what we're talking about today. And although we focus on learning mindsets in our work, I do want to acknowledge that there are lots of things that affect students' achievement. So, of course, students' current level of intelligence affects their achievement, their teacher quality and their school quality, their previous experiences. If students grew up in a low-income community versus a high-income community, that's going to impact their achievement. And related to that, structural factors like poverty and trauma. And then what we focus on, which is students' mindsets. And so these are students' beliefs about school and learning. And so these mindsets can be thought of as lenses through which students interpret their experiences in school. And particularly, these lenses are how they interpret their experiences of challenge or adversity. So that's really when you see these mindsets making the biggest impact. So that's why they impact students who are members of stigmatized groups or students who are taking really hard classes like math or organic chemistry in college, because they serve as lenses through which students interpret challenges. And these mindsets can make learning feel really different depending on what your beliefs are. So students in some mindsets can think of school as a safe and exciting place. But other mindsets can make learning feel threatening and scary, or even just plain boring. And so these different narratives that students construct don't just interpret the way that they, or don't just impact the way that they interpret challenges, but they also determine the behaviors that students choose to engage in. So there are lots of consequences for how students not just view the classroom, but how they act in the classroom. Do they raise their hand? Do they revise their work? How do they react when they get a bad grade on a test? Things like that. And so there are kind of three learning mindsets that research has shown impacts students' perseverance and particularly their achievement in the face of a challenge. So one of these is growth mindset, and that's the belief that intelligence can be developed. And we'll talk more about that. That's what we'll be focusing on today. Another is belonging, and that's the belief that one is respected and valued by teachers and peers and fits in one's learning environment. So a student who has a sense of belonging feels like people like me can succeed here. My teacher cares about me. And purpose and relevance is the third one that we focus on. And this is the belief that one's schoolwork is valuable because it is personally relevant and connected to a larger purpose. So do students understand how what they're learning in school relates to their daily lives, how it can be useful in the real world? And also how school can not just help them make money and get a good job, but how can it help them contribute to society at large? We find that these types of purpose are really what's motivating to students. They want to know how they can make an impact. So like I said, we're going to spend today talking about a growth mindset in particular, and we'll organize this into two parts. So we'll start by defining what are the two mindsets about intelligence, what are the consequences, how does this change the way students view the classroom and how they behave in the classroom, and then we'll focus on how do we actually change these beliefs. How do you teach students to have a growth mindset by teaching them about the brain? And then how can our language and through our daily interactions promote a growth mindset? So there are two different mindsets that Carol Dweck, who pioneered this work, has identified. One is a fixed mindset, and this is the belief that intelligence is a fixed trait. So people who have a fixed mindset of intelligence tend to think of it kind of like eye color. You either have blue eyes or you don't. You're born with certain talents and abilities and not others, and there's nothing really you can do to change that. While other students or people in general, it's not just students, of course we all have these beliefs, have more of a growth mindset. They believe that intelligence is malleable and that you can develop it through effort, through trying new things, through learning. They tend to think of intelligence more like a muscle. Just like when you work out at the gym, your muscles get stronger. When you work hard to learn new things, your brain gets stronger and smarter. And although we talk about this as, students have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset, of course people can be anywhere in the middle. And we actually measure this on a continuum. So I wanted to show you how we actually assess students' mindsets, and you can just think about how much you agree with these statements and kind of assess your own mindset right now. So we have students rate their agreement on a scale of 1 to 6, with statements like you can learn new things, but you can't really change your basic intelligence, and your intelligence is something about you that you can't change very much. And of course, the more you disagree with these statements, the more of a growth mindset you have, and the more you agree with these statements, the more of a fixed mindset you have. And notably, you can have different mindsets in different domains. So you can have a growth mindset about your intelligence and a fixed mindset about your athletic ability. You could also have a growth or fixed mindset in domains within school. So you can have a fixed mindset about your ability to do math, but a growth mindset about your ability to learn how to write. It could be even more granular than that. Certain classroom environments can lead students to act in more of a fixed mindset way or more of a growth mindset way. And then getting down even to the finest level of granularity, even if you have a really strong growth mindset in a particular class, we all have fixed mindset thoughts sometimes. So I just wanted to start with that note that this is very nuanced, and although we're talking about it for simplicity, as people with a fixed mindset do this and people with a growth mindset do that, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're all shifting in and out of these different mindsets. So I'll turn it over to Jackie to talk about the consequences of these beliefs in the classroom.
So we're going to shift back to talking about these in a very kind of dichotomous way. So there has been a lot of work showing that some students really do hold this kind of more general idea about intelligence being fixed and their ability to improve in school being fixed, or growth mindset. And these beliefs really do have very important consequences for the kinds of goals that students have, how much they value effort, and their responses to failure or challenge and setbacks. So students with a fixed mindset, their goal in the classroom is really to look smart. And this makes sense when you think about it in terms of this belief that you're born with a certain amount of intelligence, and then you're in a school environment where you're being challenged and you're being evaluated on your abilities. Then you want to make sure that you show that you have that ability. And so they are less likely to ask questions in class. They're less likely to expose that they don't know something. And students with a growth mindset, on the other hand, are much more likely to have the goal of learning in class. And so the ways that these were sort of teased apart about how students had these beliefs, they were asked how much they agreed or disagreed with these kinds of statements. So students with a fixed mindset were more likely to agree with the statement, "The main thing I want when I do my schoolwork is to show how good at it I am," versus a student with a growth mindset is more likely to agree with the statement, "It's much more important to me to learn new things in my classes than it is to get the best grade." And so in terms of the evidence for this difference in goal pursuit, we have this wonderful study that was done that showed brain activation during a certain activity. So I'm going to show you what this was. So students were given a bunch of trivia questions, and they were answering these questions by typing their response into a computer, and then they were told whether they got the answer right or wrong. And they measured their brain activation when they were given the answers. And it turns out all students care about whether they got the answer right or wrong. But what they did next was they showed them the correct answer, and then they measured their brain activation again. And what they found was really interesting, was that the students with a fixed mindset, there was no brain activation. They weren't paying attention. They were only interested in knowing, did I get it right or wrong? And so later they gave another set of trivia questions that were similar to the first ones. I think these ones were the same as the first ones. And then it turns out, well, what do you know? The ones who were paying attention to what the right answer was, they did better. So the students with the growth mindset did better on the second set of questions. So what about effort? So students with a fixed mindset are more likely to see effort as an indictment of low ability. So they actually see having to try hard at something as evidence that they don't have that innate ability, and so what's the point? If you have to try at something, it must mean you're not very good at it. Whereas students with a growth mindset are more likely to see effort as how you get better at something. So they're more likely to increase their effort. So the statements that these students were likely to agree with, students with a fixed mindset, they would agree with, to tell the truth, when I work hard at my schoolwork, it makes me feel like I'm not very smart. Whereas students with a growth mindset were likely to agree with, the harder you work at something, the better you'll be at it. And so what about reactions to failure? So students with a fixed mindset are more likely to have a helpless response and give up in the face of failure, and students with a growth mindset are more likely to increase their effort. And so the statements they were likely to agree with, fixed mindset, they were asked if how they would respond if they failed a test or they were doing poorly in a class. I would spend less time on this subject from now on. I would try not to take this subject ever again. And most interestingly, I would cheat on the next exam, which I find that to be really, it makes me feel a lot of compassion for these students who are cheating, because it makes me think that that's their idea, is that that's the only way I'm going to get through this hoop that I have to jump through to get to the next level. So it gives me a lot of compassion for these students, to want to help them. So students with a growth mindset, on the other hand, if they experience a setback, they're more likely to say, I would work harder at this class from now on. I would spend more time studying for the next test. And so over time, what you see is that these students with a fixed mindset, particularly when they enter a new environment that's more challenging, so the transition into middle school where it becomes a lot more difficult, you've got harder classes and new structures, students typically will show a decrease in their performance, whereas students with a growth mindset are more likely to show improvements over time. And so I'll hand it back to Carissa, who's going to tell you about some of the research around this to show how this is showing up in students' achievement.
So we recently had the opportunity at PERTS to look at the relationship between growth mindset and achievement in an entire nation. So actually, we put it in the Chilean National Achievement Test, so all the 10th graders in the nation of Chile that were taking this National Achievement Test also had to do a growth mindset survey. And what we found was really striking. Of course, we expected to find a relationship, but the relationship that we found was very strong. So students with a growth mindset were 3 times more likely to score in the top 5th on this national achievement test, and students with a fixed mindset were 4 times more likely to score in the bottom 5th on this national achievement test. And this is a sample of almost 150,000 students. So I think this is really strong evidence that there's an important predictive power of students' mindsets about intelligence. So given that these mindsets influence students' achievement and influence how students experience the classroom, whether they view it as evaluative and threatening or as a place where they can come to grow and develop, an important question is, how can we change these mindsets? And there are kind of 2 strategies that we can use to change students' mindsets. One is to directly teach students about the malleability of the brain, and that's where a lot of research has been done in psychology. And the second is to change our language, so change how we interact with students every day. Because our language really tells students what we believe and what we value, and then they pick up those beliefs, of course, from us. And so I want to talk about an online intervention where we taught students about the malleability of the brain. So the basic message of these programs that teach students about the neuroscience of the brain in order to help them develop a growth mindset is that the brain is like a muscle. It gets stronger when you learn new things and you work it out. So here's a sample of what this online program looks like. You can see that it's pretty simple. It's just text and some pictures. There's also some audio that goes along with it. We needed to make it possible so that students, even with poor internet connections, could access it. So we couldn't have like videos or anything. And so you can see that here's the basic message. The brain is like a muscle. It gets stronger and smarter when you exercise it. And you exercise your brain by working on challenging material that makes you think hard. So it's teaching them about neuroplasticity. So in addition to learning that the brain is malleable, they learn how the brain is malleable. They learn that the brain is made up of neurons and that these neurons are connected to each other. And these connections can be weak or strong. When they're strong, the brain thinks more quickly, and that's what makes people smarter. And the way that you make these connections stronger is by working hard on challenging things and learning new things. And it discusses the implications for intelligence and effort. So here's an example of what that looks like. Students see pictures of neurons, and they learn that when you work hard to learn something new, the connections in your brain get stronger, and over time, this can make you smarter.
This is scientifically proven?
Yes, so there's neuroscience research showing that is how the brain works. The brain is made up of neurons. The connections are weak or strong. That's kind of how habits form, right? When you do something over and over again, the neural pathways in your brain get stronger, and you're more likely to do that thing. And learning works the same way. So there are some really great videos that you can look up on YouTube that kind of explains this concept of neuroplasticity. And there's a really so one interesting study that I think really is powerful in helping people understand that the brain is malleable is the study with London taxi cab drivers. So I'll tell you about that and a study on rats, actually, because they kind of make 2 different points. So the London taxi cab driver study looked at the part of the brain in the London taxi cab drivers that is responsible for spatial awareness. And they have to take this really hard test in order to become a cab driver in London. And the streets of London are not organized in a grid, so it's really, really hard. And this test is called the Knowledge. It's known as that to all of the cab drivers in London that have to take this because it's really, really hard. And when you look at this part of the brain in taxi cab drivers compared to the general population, it's larger in London taxi cab drivers. And you might think, oh, well, that means that, of course, that's why they pass the knowledge. They have this part of the brain that's stronger and better. But what's interesting is that the longer that they've been a taxi cab driver, the bigger it got. And when they stopped being a taxi cab driver, it got smaller again. So it suggests that it's really the result of their experience studying for this test and having to learn these different streets. Another really interesting study that was done with rats, but I think is still very applicable to humans, it turns out our brains are kind of similar to rats in some ways. A lot of neuroscientists use lab rats to do their research. They put rats in different types of cages. So they put some rats in empty cages where they were all by themselves. They didn't have anything to do. It's kind of sad. And they put other rats in these more rich environments where they could like play with things, and they had one of those little like spinny wheels, and they got to interact with other rats. So they had this more rich environment. And then, unfortunately, they killed the rats, and they measured their weight of their brains. And the rats who were in these challenging environments had heavier brains than the rats that were in these empty cages. So it really shows that our environments are, not just shaping what we know, but it's really shaping our brains. So yeah, great question. Okay, so going back to the intervention, it also discusses the implications of this work for strategies in help seeking. Of course, effort isn't enough. If you're trying to help a student develop a growth mindset, it's not just enough to tell them, if you just try really hard, your brain will get stronger and smarter, because that's not true. If you do something over and over again, but you're doing the wrong thing, your brain is not going to grow and you're not going to learn anything. You're still going to have trouble with whatever it is that you're working on. So sometimes you need to try different strategies. You can ask a student who knows how to do the problem for ideas, ask your teacher, step back and try a couple different approaches to the problem. And it might take some time to figure out what strategy works for you, but that's really important because it's not just about beating your head against the wall and putting a lot of effort in until you just magically get it. And then the intervention also includes different quotes from scientists explaining explaining how this neuroscience works, and also quotes from other students explaining how they've experienced this in their own life. We did a number of focus groups of students to understand what components would make this intervention more compelling, and that was a really big thing for students. So we also had quotes from celebrities. We talked about LeBron James, we talked about Scott Forstall, the creator of the iPhone, and we had Michelle Obama talking about a growth mindset. So just to kind of get students to see that a growth mindset has helped these people that are very successful, and people like them, like other students. And then finally, the students do a writing exercise to help reinforce this message. And the writing exercise is having students give advice to another student that doesn't know about this research. So you can see we say, can you explain the truth about smartness to new students coming to 9th grade next year? And then we remind them of the things they learned so that they can write this essay to new students. And there are a couple important things about this writing exercise. One is that it's helping students just recall the information they just learned, also endorse the message because they're convincing someone else. And it presents the intervention as honorific rather than remedial. We're not giving you a program to help you. You're helping us make our program better. And that's actually true. We then use what these students say to improve the program. So we tested this online program, which was, this is a 245-minute session program. And we tested a similar program that was actually shorter and didn't include the quotes, with 1,500 students from 13 schools across the United States. And this was a really nice sample because it was really diverse. So students range from schools with less than 5% on free and reduced lunch to over 90% of students on free and reduced lunch. And so they were randomly assigned to one of two programs, one similar to the one that you just saw, except it was shorter. and the control condition. And our control condition for these programs just teaches students about the brain, but not that it's malleable. So they learn about the different lobes of the brain, how scientists study the brain. So one technology is a machine like the one below called an fMRI scanner. So it kind of looks the same, and they're still learning about the brain, but they're not learning this key information that the brain is malleable. And then in these studies, we then collect students' transcripts at the end of the year, and we look at their GPAs in the semester after the intervention. And what we found in this particular study is that underperforming students who were in the growth mindset group had significantly higher GPAs than students who were in this control group. And they were randomized at the individual level. So they would go into the classroom, they would sit down at their computer, they'd all be read the exact same instructions by their teacher, and then once they signed in, the computer would just randomize them to either do the growth mindset one or the control one. So it's a really nice controlled study. Okay, so, and I again just want to make the point about that these mindsets really are important when students are experiencing a challenge. So it makes sense that we'd see this impact, particularly on underachieving students. But that doesn't mean that that developing these mindsets isn't important for high achieving students. If we want them to go on and do something meaningful in life, then they're going to be challenged. That's inevitable. And we want to prepare them to respond adaptively to that challenge. And that's why I mentioned the study earlier about organic chemistry. You see a prediction of mindsets and grades in classes like that that are really difficult. Okay, so now I want to turn to talking about how we can change mindsets through our daily interactions. And I think this is what's really exciting for parents, because you're talking to your kids all the time, and this kind of teaching them about the neuroscience is exciting and interesting, but it's kind of a one-time conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackie to jump into the work on praise. And you can skip that if you want.
No, I love this stuff.
Okay.
So I'm sure all of you are probably familiar with the self-esteem movement. Began in the 70s, and it really had the best of intentions. I'm seeing nodding heads. The child with the trophy who got 5th place is probably familiar to you. So, you know, there was the best of intentions, right? There was this idea that self-esteem really matters. Like, it was the beginning of starting to think about students' subjective experience, and that their internal experience was really important. And it was making these attempts at the idea that, well, if you praise kids a lot, and you tell them that they're really wonderful and they're really talented and they're really smart, and you give every kid on the team a trophy, no matter how well they did, that would make them feel better and they would do better in life. But then what started to show up was that it actually didn't quite help. And it turns out there's some counterintuitive ideas, like bullies actually have pretty high self-esteem. And so, you know, maybe there's something not quite right here. And so in this study, Carol Dweck and Claudia Mueller were kind of probing this question of, is there a difference between the type of praise? Does it have a different kind of effect on kids? And so what they wanted to what they did was they had a large group of 5th graders come in, and they gave these 5th graders IQ tests. So these are standard progressive matrices, Raven's progressive matrices, and they're kind of ambiguous. They're meant to be culture neutral. So is anybody familiar with these kinds of problems? So they gave these 5th graders a bunch of these problems. They were moderately difficult IQ tests, and then they wanted to see what the effect would be of different kinds of praise. So what they did was they told the control group, wow, that's a really good score. It's just kind of neutral. It's not really making any attribution for why they did good. The intelligence condition, so they were praising their intelligence. They said, wow, that's a really good score. You must be smart at this. And in the effort praise condition, they said, wow, that's a really good score. You must have tried really hard. And then what they did was they gave all of the students another set of problems, only these ones were quite a bit more difficult. So this is more difficult than what these 5th graders were given, but this is just to give you an example of what a really challenging problem looked like. So does anybody want to take a guess at what the answer is on this one? So then they gave all these kids these problems, and they told them all the same thing. Wow, that's a lot worse.
So just a note. So I think Jackie already said this, but just to note that the problems that the students completed weren't actually that hard. And also, they weren't doing like the full IQ test, because that takes really long. They just selected a random set of problems of, you know, the different difficulty levels.
Yeah. So what they did after that this was the design of the study, was they wanted to see how these kids would do after a setback. So the hard set of problems, getting the feedback that you did a lot worse. So then they gave them another set of problems that were the same level of difficulty as the first set, and they were looking at how did these kids do on the second set. So just to review the study design again, they started by completing moderately difficult problems. They received a different kind of feedback, either neutral, praise for their intelligence, or praise for their effort. And then they received the difficult set of problems, and they all got the same negative feedback, and they were looking at the difference in performance on these two sets of moderately difficult problems. And what they found was, this second set, you would expect that a student would do probably a little bit better, but about the same, because they've had a little more practice, they might do a little better. And with the control condition, that is what you saw, is that the students did about the same, but a little bit better. Students with a growth mindset, though, they actually did a lot better on the second set. And so their interpretation of, like, I did poorly on this other one, maybe I need to try harder. They were praised for doing well because of their effort, so they increased their effort. What's interesting, though, is that the students who were given this fixed mindset praise did significantly worse. So the attribution that they were given was, the reason why I did well on the first set is because I was smart, so doing poorly, that must mean that I'm dumb. So they internalized that, and then when they got the moderately difficult problems again, they're still carrying this belief that, well, I guess I'm not that good after all. But another aspect of the study that was really interesting is that as students were leaving, they were asked to report their score anonymously. They were just asking them to complete, like, what the study was like for them and what their score was. And what they found is that the students who had been given this praise for their intelligence were significantly more likely to lie about their score. And they only lied in one direction. So I'll hand it back to Carissa, who's going to talk about another really interesting study on this.
So in my own work, again, I'm really interested in how these things kind of play out in the real world and how we can change them in the real world. With other researchers at Stanford and researchers at University of Chicago, we wanted to look at how parents' praise in the real world impacts students' mindsets. So we looked at parents' praise when children were very young, and then we assessed their mindsets 5 years later. So we had these videotapes from another research project of 53 naturalistic parent-child interactions. So this was the primary caregiver, I think in the study was all moms, interacting with their child at ages 14 months, 26 months, and 38 months. And we had these transcripts of every single thing they said at these 3 time points and every single utterance. And we coded all the utterances to pull out the praise ones. And then we labeled them as either process, person, or other. And then 5 years later, so this data was pre-collected, we didn't wait 5 years, we had the students complete a survey assessing mindset. So this was at ages around 7 to 8, so about 2nd or 3rd grade. And then we looked to see if the way that parents praise their kids had an impact on these students' mindsets. And we found that they did. Parents who gave their children process praise at 1 to 3 years old had children with more of a growth mindset 5 years later. And I think this is really striking because the children are getting lots of different messages from other people in addition to the primary caregiver. So, they are getting different information from their other parent, from grandparents, and they're in school by this age, so they're getting information from their teachers. So I think it's really reassuring as a parent to know that what you do with your child has an impact on their beliefs, despite the fact that they're getting all this other input from other people. One interesting thing to note about this study that we found and weren't necessarily predicting is that girls actually got significantly less process praise. And I think this is really interesting. So we know that this is the kind of praise that promotes a growth mindset, that helps children develop resilience and stay resilient in the face of a challenge. And it's unfortunate that girls are not getting this praise that helps them remain more resilient in the face of a challenge when they're young. And so Carol Dweck often talks about kind of the curse of bright girls. And what she says is that a lot of bright girls are used to getting praised a lot when they're young. They're told, oh, you're such a good girl, you're so well behaved, you're so smart, you're so pretty. But boys oftentimes are told things like, well, if you just would sit still, if you just would do this, then you would get it. And so even though, the girls feel good in the moment, later when they're faced with a setback, they're crushed. And so this can really have an impact on, what they end up doing later in life, and if they feel like they can rise to a challenge. Okay, so I'm happy to talk more about the gender thing later during the Q&A, because I'm personally very interested in that. All right, so for now, I want to show you some adorable videos of what a fixed mindset actually looks like in children and what a growth mindset looks like in children. And we're going to do young children because they're cute. So these are videos borrowed from another researcher, Allison Master, and they asked students, would you rather work on an easy puzzle where you'll, do really well, you won't have a hard time, you'll get it quickly, or a hard puzzle? And then they asked them why. And these were their answers.
Easy is with an E.
I can only do easy ones. Because easy is the best. Because sometimes I'm lazy. Because I can't do hard ones, only I can do easy ones. Because I don't think it's
Because you don't think you can do the other one? Okay.
might be hard for me. The easy one gets you ready for the harder one.
It's kind of ambiguous.
Because you don't give you a very long work to do it. Then you don't get so tired.
Okay, now, so those are cute, and some of them are also a little bit heartbreaking, I think. All right, so now let's look at how children with a growth mindset responded.
I like to learn how to do things hard, so when I grow bigger, then I can do things hard. Because I like to do it, because I can learn, then I can teach my mommy to do it.
So
If
cute.
she wants the same one, or if there's another one you want, I can teach her the right way. It trains my mind. Because I want to be like the big kids and be able to go in kindergarten even sooner. I'm going to show you how good I am on hard puzzles. I don't really exactly like doing easy ones because I like counts. How about these puzzle that these 20 gave me and it's hard to just it builds up my brain.
It builds up my brain.
If it takes a long time, then you think more in your brain and then you figure it out more.
When I showed these videos to a group of venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, they said after this video, future entrepreneur. I thought that was kind of funny. Okay, so those adorable videos, I want to turn to talking about another way that we can modify our language to encourage more of a growth mindset. So what about when students haven't succeeded, when they're still struggling with something and you want to encourage them? What do you say to them then? So we recently collaborated with Khan Academy to do a study to look at this. And so what we did is we put different sentences above fraction problems. So these are, if you're not familiar with Khan Academy, this is the Khan Academy website, and you can see that the problem is here. I'll just read it so you can actually see what's up here. Daniel ate 5 slices of pizza, and Gabriella ate 2 slices. If there were 5 slices remaining, what fraction of the pizza was eaten? And then they put their answer over there, and students get to move on to the next topic once they've answered a certain percentage of problems correctly in a row. So they're deemed proficient once they do that. And so our outcome measure was, how many proficiencies did students get? And the sentences were up here right above the fraction problem. And we had several different conditions. So we had 2 different control kinds of statements, just random science statements, like, did you know sound travels faster and hotter than cold air? To control for the fact that we were talking about the brain, which is science related. Kind of weird, and I imagine people thought that was just odd to be there. And then there were placebo encouragement. Some of these problems are hard. Just do your best. Or if at first you don't succeed, try again. And I love these control messages because I think on the surface they seem like growth mindset sentences because you're talking about effort, right? But when students are, haven't solved something yet and they haven't been able to see how their effort leads to success, it's not really a useful thing to say. So what a growth mindset statement would be in this situation would be sentences that help them understand why effort leads to success. So remember, the more you practice, the smarter you become. So the reason effort is important is because it helps you build up your brain. Or when you learn a new kind of math problem, you grow your math brain. And what we found is that students who received growth mindset sentences earned significantly more proficiencies. So I just want to, again, make a note here about effort. I think, especially because one of the most well-known studies in this area of research is that Mueller and Dweck study that I love and that Jackie presented. I think because that's such a popular study, a lot of times people come away after hearing this growth mindset research and think, I just need to talk about effort a lot. Effort is what's really important. But it's really not just about talking about effort. It's about highlighting growth and development and encouraging students to master concepts, but showing them that the process is how you get there. So an even better type of process praise than just saying good effort is being more specific. What are the specific actions that students took to achieve their success? And the more specific you can be, the better. And I think unless you know students did put in a lot of effort, you don't want to say good effort, because if they didn't put in a lot of effort, they might think, well, I didn't try that hard, I must be very smart. And that can then unintentionally reinforce a fixed mindset. So I think that's a really important caveat to this work. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about is giving critical feedback. So this was a study that was done with teachers, and so they had students write these different essays, and they had teachers grade them. So they just graded them normally. They wrote a bunch of comments on the paper, and then the researchers took this stack of papers that the teachers had already graded, and they randomly divided them, and they put different messages on the different stacks of paper. So half of the students got a sticky note that said, I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I know that you can reach them. And the other half of the students, the control group, got a message saying, I'm giving you these comments so that you'll have feedback on your paper. So very neutral and direct. And then they looked at which group of students was more likely to revise their paper. And they found that students in the wise feedback group were more likely to revise their paper. And so giving this kind of wise critical feedback that tells students that you have high standards, but also assures them that they can meet them, promotes growth mindset behavior, like persevering despite getting critical feedback and revising your work. Okay, and then so the last thing that I want to talk about is new research being done by Kyla Heimovitz, one of Carol Dweck's current graduate students, and she's looking specifically at parents' mindsets. She's calling them failure mindsets, but it's really how do parents think about mistakes and challenge and failures. So the way that she measures these mindsets of parents is she has them rate their agreement with statements like, the effects of failure are negative and should be avoided. Experiencing failure enhances performance and productivity. Experiencing failure facilitates learning and growth. And so on average, parents who disagree with statement number 1 and agree with statements number 2 and number 3 are more likely to have children with a growth mindset. And that's because their positive attitudes towards failure are conveying certain things to their children. They're conveying that learning and improvement are more important than just getting a good grade and performing. And they're helping them understand that failure can be good if you learn it as an if you use it as an opportunity to learn and grow. So it's not just like failure because you didn't study. It's like how did you, if you made a conceptual error, how can you learn from that? And it encourages students to take on challenges, which is really how they can grow. And if they're not afraid to fail, they're going to be more likely to take on challenges and learn new things. And this work actually kind of reminds me. So I live in San Francisco. It reminds me of kind of the Silicon Valley culture, like fail fast, fail quickly, and I think if the research showing that mindsets predict achievement and mindsets predict how students experience school isn't enough. I think it's also interesting to know that businesses are really looking for these things in their employees. And I'm actually going to be starting to work at a new company called Paradigm, in addition to staying at my role at PERTS. Where we're consulting businesses. It's a diversity consulting firm, but they're really interested in mindsets like these because people who are underrepresented groups in companies are going to be more likely to feel challenged. But in general, they want all of their employees to have these learning mindsets that help them reach their full potential and that help them remain resilient in the face of challenges, because they're doing really challenging things at these tech companies, and they want their employees to be ready to respond adaptively to these challenges and learn from them. So I think that's an interesting thing to note, because of course, as parents, rightly, we care about teaching our kids things that will help them get a good job later. And so I think it's important to note that this is one of them. Okay, so I just want to end by pointing you to a set of resources, just letting you know that it's available for you. So we recently at PERT's been working on something called the Mindset Kit to help share what we know about this work, help people understand what adaptive mindsets are, why they're important, and how to help students develop them. So we recently put up a set of resources specifically for parents, and you can check it out. It basically just explains, what is a growth mindset and what are some of the kinds of things that you can do to help your children develop a growth mindset. And so you'll see some of the summaries of the research like what we discussed today, and then also some practical tips about what you can do.